First speaker in this session is Clodagh Harris from UCC. Dr. Harris is a senior lecturer at the Department of Government and Politics and affiliate of the Environmental Research Institute. Her research focuses on deliberative and participatory democracy, democratic innovations, and deliberative democracy and climate change. She sits in the expert advisory group of Ireland Citizens' Assembly on biodiversity loss and is part of a wider consortium funded by the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage to design and implement a young persons and children's assembly on biodiversity loss. Dr. Harris's paper is entitled Towards Wellbeing for All, Participatory and Deliberative Dialogue and the Imagining a 2050 Toolkit.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I hope that's working. I hope you can see my slides. I know I've pressed.
We can indeed at the moment, yeah.
That's great. Thank you. Thanks. So good afternoon, and it's a real pleasure to be here. And thank you. So I suppose what I'd like to do today is to very briefly discuss participatory and deliberative processes to facilitate the embedding of a wellbeing framework in policy making, and I suppose to share kind of future-oriented participatory and deliberative tools that were developed as part of a research project here in Cork with colleagues up in Queen's University, Belfast. So it's the Imagining 2050 Toolkit. So I suppose one of the things that's kind of emerged as I've been listening all morning and learning so much is that I suppose, as we know, one of the most prominent contemporary developments in policy making and administration has been the rise of participatory governance innovations that seek to enhance the effectiveness and legitimacy of public agencies and policy making through various forms of public involvement and deliberation. And we know from research and that citizens' perspectives, and particularly bringing in that lived experience, brings a very important and rich and valuable source of information and knowledge that can contribute to better and fairer policies. And interestingly, I had prepared these slides and I don't need to discuss this now, because as we saw earlier in the presentation by Larry and Anne-Marie, they spoke, they outlined the recent publications by NESC. And again, I suppose spoke about that important underlying role for dialogue and consultation in developing and embedding a wellbeing framework and policy making, and indeed the need to actually optimize consultation processes. And I suppose what this brief presentation hopes to do anyway is to consider what form maybe such dialogues could take to enhance the effectiveness and the legitimacy of a wellbeing framework in Ireland and indeed our work towards it. So I suppose in terms of participation, thinking things like dialogue and consultation, like I suppose what is it? And I suppose for a start, I suppose there are many forms of public consultation, of public participation. And with any process, as with any kind of participatory process, I suppose there's no one size that's going to fit all. It can take different forms at different stages with different groups. And at different stages as well within policy cycles, or indeed, again, returning to the steps of embedding a wellbeing framework into policy making that was presented by Anne-Marie earlier and covered in that recent report. It can take place in different ways across each of those 4 steps too. So what I find helpful here, just as a kind of a general rule of thumb, is this pyramid that has been developed by Ruiz Villaverde and Garcia Rubio. They've developed it really looking at water policy, but I think there's some nice ideas there. And what they've done, I suppose, in this pyramid is they show, I suppose, they map processes according to the numbers of people involved in a forum or in a consultation and their level of participation. And we can see that it can range from being very wide, but maybe somewhat more superficial when it comes to things like information campaigns, or consultation, and then it can be maybe a smaller form of event or participation process that is deeper when we look at co-designing or co-decision making. And I suppose for my own part, indeed with the Imagining 2050 project, my interest focused more, I suppose, on those upper levels, particularly the co-designing and the co-decision making. I suppose looking at processes that require more informed, more considered forms of engagement, I suppose that move beyond mere kind of asking people for their top of their head opinions or preferences on something. And in this presentation, I'm arguing that participants should be offered opportunities to contribute to genuinely discursive processes that require more thoughtful, reflective and considered participation with fellow participants. I suppose what I would like to do next is to share some public engagement tools and maybe give a little bit of an overview of the Imagining 2050 project in a way that will supplement, hopefully, existing public participation processes in embedding a wellbeing framework and achieving those cross-cutting themes of equality and sustainability that have already been identified in public participation processes to date. So just very briefly, the Imagining 2050 project, it completed its work last year. It was a project that was hosted in the Environmental Research Institute in University College Cork, and it was funded by the Environmental Protection Agency. And there were a large number of us involved. If I click on the next slide, you'll see us all there. We were a transdisciplinary research team from Queen's University Belfast and University College Cork, and we collaborated with creative with Think Visuals, so who are involved in visual harvesting and visual engagement, and also with video consultants to develop, I suppose, to develop the toolkit and indeed some of the community engagement processes. And the aim of the research itself was to develop innovative project approaches to climate dialogues using forms of participatory and deliberative processes to co-construct visions and pathways for low carbon and climate resilient society for 2050. And one of the core elements of our work was developing deliberative futures workshops or forums that worked with communities in co-creating alternative ways to envision and plan for the future. And these workshops, this was just one particular approach that we took. I suppose there could have been others like citizens' assemblies or citizens' juries, consensus conference. The reason I suppose the futures workshop appealed to us was because it had that visioning element to us. We felt it was most appropriate for this work and its future thinking and its future orientation. So there were 3 stages. I have the links embedded in the presentation, and I'm very happy to share the slides with you or to make them available through whichever sources that are available there. But feel free to email me at my email address. It's my name @ucc.ie. And there were 3 stages to this. There were the preliminary engagements, I suppose, working with the communities to identify core issues and recruiting, I suppose, a mix of participants that kind of a diverse group of participants with diverse backgrounds, diverse opinions and diverse lived experiences of the issue of climate change in their community. The second was the engagement element, which focused on delivering a series of visioning and scenario building workshops, again following that deliberative futures format, which involved a mixture of information, critique, visioning and recommendations. And then the final stage was the post-engagement phase, which was taking those recommendations and sharing them with stakeholders, public bodies, experts in the field, and then feeding them to policymakers. So That's just to give you a sense of the participatory community engagements that took place, and those involved in those engagements also helped co-construct the toolkit that I'm about to discuss and share. Before I do that, though, I'd like to, I suppose, again, I give a bit of context to where we were coming from, in that the community engagements and indeed the way in which the toolkit was developed and the way in which we envisage the tools being used kind of are underpinned by these guiding principles, and they are inclusion. But again, this idea of ensuring that there's a kind of that there's space for all at the table, and that those who participate come from a broad diversity of opinion, of lived experience, of background, and to make sure that there's a good mix drawn from all sectors and walks of society. And then bearing in mind, I suppose, that often it's not enough to invite somebody into a process, but it's important to facilitate their participation within it. Then we placed emphasis again on this idea of equality, to ensure all involved had an opportunity to speak and also to be listened to with respect. And this involved using facilitators. And then the third element, which I suppose is very much linked to that deliberative side of the process, was this idea of, I suppose, inviting the participants to question, to justify their positions, and to come to recommendations that were based on facts and the future and the consideration of the needs of others. So again, coming actually from the work of kind of Arthur and Prius, who talk about deliberations producing fact, other, and future regarding recommendations. So, so just to give an idea, so those principles guided the engagements, the workshops, but they also underpinned how we developed the toolkit and how we used the tools. And it's, so the toolkit itself, again, I have links to that. It's available to free. It's free to download from the MARI website in UCC. And the tools were, I suppose, future oriented and deliberative. And the list within the toolkit is neither exhaustive, we're aware of that, and nor is it prescriptive. I suppose the idea is that it's to be hopefully of use to a variety of actors for wider consultations or deliberations. So what we have, I suppose, within the toolkit is it describes each tool. It also explains the material, skills and time required and rates each tool's level of difficulty. It contains clear examples of how we use them in the project. It recognises again that organisations may wish to tailor a tool to meet their own participation objectives. There are additional materials, links to additional materials by way of support within it. And there is also a section on online deliberation, again, reflecting, I suppose, modern post-COVID reality of kind of how we engage now. And as many of the tools that I'll be presenting just very briefly here, they're not new, I suppose, but some have been around for decades. But what is new about them is the way in which they're offered as a suite of techniques with which to engage stakeholders, communities, the wider public, in discussions that are both future-oriented, participatory and deliberative. I suppose just another thing to add, that by and large, the tools have endeavoured to take a creative communicative approach, again, to facilitate, I suppose, various forms of discussion, but also used doodles and storytelling and mapping, but it can be a very powerful way. Those kind of creative methods can be a very powerful way of, I suppose, imagining different futures or developing visions for the future, as well as enhancing trust. So the first two tools that I wish to share with you, I'm going to share 4, but there are more in the toolkit. And as I said, this is far from exhaustive. So the first one I suppose I wish to share here, it and the one after it, storyboarding, are 2 specific tools that lend themselves very well to futures thinking. And I was very struck by what the governor of the central bank had to say there about how, I suppose, the need for greater for commitment to longer term thinking and longer term planning. Suppose that's one of the things that's kind of guided us in the development of those engagements and the use of these tools as well. So it's a very simple tool. It just basically involves invites participants to choose a picture, usually from a pre-prepared display of kind of cutouts from newspapers, magazines, postcards, photographs, and they're invited to choose a picture that reflects or captures their concerns or priorities on an issue. Once the pictures have been chosen, then in small groups, people are invited to present the image to their fellow participants and why they've chosen it. And once everybody's had an opportunity to do that, then it's just moving beyond that, putting the pictures aside and then starting to deliberate on the meaning of the issue at hand. And in the case of our project, it was on climate change. And then I suppose then also inviting the participants in the framing that we took, but again, it could be a different type of framing for another approach or another participation objective. We invited the participants to kind of consider the impacts of climate change, both personally at the community level, kind of wider impacts, national, global, but also then to look to the future too on that and future impacts for future generations. And this tool is, it's useful for a wider form of participation, for example, a broad discussion or the early stage of a participation event, and can be used to raise awareness, scrutinize the existing state of play, find meaning for uncertain, unpredictable issues, and identify knowledge gaps. And I suppose what it can be particularly useful is used as a first step to this next tool, which is a deeper form of engagement. But as I said, this is not prescriptive, and it might be the case that a group may just choose to do sense making alone. So storyboarding, again, is one that lends itself well to futures thinking. So it requires a deeper form of engagement, and as a result is, I suppose, rated by us as more difficult because it requires the preparation of a storyboard template. Again, that's in keeping with the objective of the consultation or the participatory process, and it's more suited again to those co-creative, co-decision making events, and it involves breaking a vision down into smaller, more detailed elements and considering the relationships between actors and institutions. It can be effective and exploring trade-offs, as was mentioned earlier, and refining and developing ideas. And just for example, we developed a storyboard that had 3 distinct layers. Again, it was around the issue of climate change. The first layer identified the community, the inner one identified the community's main concerns about climate change. The middle one concentrated on priorities linked to those core concerns. And the final outer layer explored the visions of the group, their visions for the future, and I suppose, and also developed or suggested some actions and strategies to get there. So as I said, it can come after sense making, drawing on what has come from the sense making process and just working on it further and refining it. The next tool I suppose I wished to share is empathy mapping, and this is described as a human-centered tool. And it, I suppose, going back to that idea of being other regarding or considering the needs of others, I suppose it invites us as participants to step into the shoes of a citizen that's different from ourselves. It asks people to identify as a different current or future citizen, and to explore how they might be impacted by an issue. It has, I suppose, great potential to facilitate intergenerational solidarity. For instance, empathy mapping could be used to ask a modern day teenager, what does well-being look like in Ireland today, to a person who's over 70 and living on the state's old age pension, or in turn, a similar question, the same question could be asked of a pensioner. What does well-being look like in Ireland for a modern day teenager, or what might it look like for them by the time they are retired? And again, this work is done in groups, capturing ideas, and I suppose imagining the future in a more, I suppose, inclusive way, bringing the needs of others to our visions or imaginings of our alternative futures and what we would want them to look like, and then teasing out how we get there. The final tool that I thought might be of use or appropriate for today's discussions is community mapping. And I suppose we looked at communities of place. So we were looking at two distinct geographies. So, two particular towns, so Athlone and Ballincollig, but it could also be used, some of these approaches could be used at a much larger level, at a smaller level, or indeed, I imagine, to communities of interest. So again, what it does is its members in the community use maps of their area to identify concerns, prioritize concerns, and start to imagine what this, in this case now it's a particular geographical area, imagine what the future could look like there and identify changes that could be made and deliberate on pathways to these alternative futures. And I suppose where it does have real value is, I suppose, it can harness local expertise and local experience on the ground to co-create possible solutions to wicked policy issues. I suppose it's another way of engaging a community per se in a visioning exercise and be a way of imagining, I suppose, alternative futures, and can be also a tool for evaluation, review, and monitoring. So speaking, I suppose, of evaluation and monitoring, I suppose what we would say too is that any tools or any engagement process should be subject themselves to evaluation and where necessary adapted and revised and refined. And the toolkit proposes a participatory evaluation process that includes 3 methods: a feedback board, an open-ended evaluation, and a questionnaire. And I suppose then just kind of coming towards the conclusion, because we recognise that with any of these processes, and indeed with they're not without their challenges and indeed the risks. On our side, from the challenges that I've presented here were particular challenges that we came across in the project itself, one of them being around recruitment and achieving diversity and representation can be challenging. It requires, I suppose, a lot of effort to mobilize participants and then to facilitate participation while when people have been mobilized to participate. And it can involve being kind of working with local gatekeepers and require time. Training and facilitation requirements, certainly for a deliberative process, facilitation is required to make sure voices are heard and listened to with respect, and this can require training. And then one of the things we also, I suppose, linked to those two other items, it's the need for sustainable resources and capacity building to support and to promote and support engagement. And I suppose that requires commitment, requires commitment to allocating the resources and commitment to the values of these processes too. There are, of course, huge risks with any participation process too, in that there can be little or no uptake of the recommendations or even a failure to respond to the output of a public engagement, and that can be counterproductive. And also poorly designed processes that are also counterproductive in that they can lead to maybe weak quality discussions and weak outcomes. Again, I suppose just to return to the challenge of recruitment and ensuring inclusion, we worked with people aged 18 and over, but I think increasingly it is increasingly important to ensure the voices of children and young people are heard, and there are obviously many processes in which that can be done. And like most recent one that comes to mind is the Children and Young People's Assembly on Citizens Assembly on Biodiversity Loss as a deliberative future focused process that could do that. So I suppose just to conclude, so what's offered here, they're future-oriented, participatory and deliberative processes and tools. They're not offered as a panacea, and they're just perhaps maybe of value to future processes. So not all will be valuable at all steps in embedding a well-being framework. They don't seek to replace other forms of participation or public participation. They endeavour to complement them, and their usefulness will hinge on the wider political context, the objectives of the participation, the consultation process, and the resources are available. And I probably should add there the commitment to them too. And as we work, I suppose as we work towards the well-being for all, the tools are offered, as I said, with the aim of supporting the development of a more participatory, deliberative and future-oriented way of politics and policy making. But I suppose, again, to echo a point made by the Governor in his the question and answer session, I suppose that underpinnings or brings us towards more long-term thinking, more long-term planning, and in my own words here, I suppose brings us beyond short-term thinking that we see with electoral cycles. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Harris. No, normally we'd wait until the end of the session for a bit of Q&A, but I think Clodagh has a scheduling issue, so we'll just have a few questions directly for her here. One of these is that has the toolkit been used with hard to reach or marginalized groups, and how effective has it proven to be?
Excellent question. We developed this toolkit as part of a research project, and as we were working with the communities, I suppose we were very clear from the get-go, or from the beginning, that it was part of a research project. So I know that there has been interest in the toolkit, but to give you a quick answer, I do not know as of yet whether it has these tools. There are tools within the toolkit that have most certainly been used working with marginalized communities, and that would definitely be the case with the sense-making tools, the empathy mapping tools, and the community mapping tools, kind of nationally and internationally. Yeah, so I suppose hopefully that's the short answer to that, but we haven't used them with marginalized communities. But if somebody else can answer that, I'd be very grateful if they'd add. I'm not the complete source of all knowledge and how they've been used elsewhere.
Yeah, we put it out there anyway. Just another question here, Clodagh, from John McGeady. It's an interesting one. Recognizing the pyramid of public participation, can Clodagh comment further on steps to ensure that public participation in deliberative decision-making is democratically representative of the public will in a community, rather than result in policy capture by self-electing interest groups?
Yeah, that's another excellent question. I suppose when we're thinking mostly about deliberative decision making, I suppose my own background in this comes from looking a lot at deliberative mini publics like citizens' assemblies, citizens' juries, and this deliberative futures forum. Now, with the citizens' assemblies and the citizens' juries, that's done through stratified random selection, and the outcomes of which go back to political institutions, so go back to the houses of the Oireachtas, and in some cases onwards to the public in the face, with a public referendum. Within the deliberative processes themselves, there needs to be accountability, there needs to be transparency, and there needs to be and the facilitation. This is where I suppose there's a key role for facilitation, is to ensure that no one participant or no one group per se can dominate the discussions in a way that excludes other viewpoints. In terms of self-electing interest groups, I'm not certain what forgive me, John, I'm not certain what you have in mind there. Perhaps with all these processes, there's an element of self-selection, in that there's no compulsion to participate. But the deliberative processes I'm thinking of, there's no election into the deliberative process. So maybe I've missed, that would be my sense, is that, but yes, they need to be transparent, they need to be held and evaluated, and an accountability within them too, where those participate. Yeah, self-selection. So the people who get involved are those who are interested. Absolutely, John, and that is a challenge. Yeah, that is an absolute challenge, going back to kind of the point I was making there around mobilization and facilitation, because some of these processes are quite time-consuming, so that can be challenging in terms of how they're organized to make sure that certain age groups or certain, you know, that there's a huge gendered element to that because of the care commitments, So I suppose that's where it requires kind of imagination and creativity around how they're designed and the supports that are put in place to facilitate participation. There was a really excellent piece of work done by colleagues in Scotland around how to, what is it, the phrase they use in the report is how to, those who are easily, they don't use the word marginalized, they say easy to ignore. And I'm very happy to share it either through the conference or with yourself, John, in person. It's by Dr. Ruth Lightbody, and one of the co-authors as well was Oliver Escobar, but they have certainly guidelines about how processes could be developed to make them more inclusive in that regard, and processes of facilitation.
Yeah, I suppose a dilemma that's as old as the hills, long before we had well-being, or long going on, going all the way back, is the issue of ensuring that one interest group or individuals don't dominate a process like that. But as you say, Clodagh, it's something that definitely is something that's integral to getting things done properly. Yeah, Dr. Clodagh Harris, thank you very much for joining us today, and for that perspective that I think really brings it down to the nitty gritty of what's required once we start talking about these issues in a very real and local sense. Now, our next speaker is Peter Dorn from Queen's University in Belfast. Dr. Dorn is a founding member of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance Hub on the island of Ireland, and has worked with the Carnegie United Kingdom Trust on a wellbeing outcomes framework for the Northern Ireland Programme for Government. He's a senior lecturer at the School of Law at Queen's and a senior writer with the International Institute for Sustainable Development's Reporting Services at UN Negotiations on Environment and Development. The title of his paper is Wellbeing Narratives, Inciting the Pluriverse on Our Island of Stories. It Takes a Movement. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Mick, it's wonderful to be with you. I'm speaking today from the hallowed halls of Belfast City Council, where I've been facilitating a simulation of the climate change negotiations with young people from across the schools of Northern Ireland. So I'm not in my drawing room. These are not my normal environments. Now, I want to talk to you initially about the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, and then I'll share some slides with you about some of my own theoretical and practical background about the connections that I expect that we'll be making in the context of our work as an Irish hub of the Global Economy Alliance. Now, some of you will be familiar with the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, which is it's actually a global network. It was co-founded about 3 or 4 years ago by Catherine Trebeck and a number of others. It's an alliance that focuses on the economic dimension and the economic narrative that dominates much of our governmental decision-making, and of course, the choices we make as citizens and participants in the private sector. Catherine has a big focus on the need to both make visible that dominant narrative that we associate with capital, with the paradigm of neoliberalism. So there's a dominant entrenched system of thought and practice, which curtails and often compromises our well-being. We're well aware of the ecological, the outer dimensions of the destruction wrought by our dominant economic logics. But I would say, and it's part of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance thinking, that there's an inner deficit created by the dominant economic narratives of neoliberalism and capital as well. Not just the atrophy that kicks in when we are reduced to the role of spectator citizens in our own lives, in politics, and indeed in economic transformation. So the project of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance is to foreground the need for a deep engagement, a problematization, if you like, of the issues around the growth economy, the growth-led economy, extractivism, and the way in which the modern forms of economic, sometimes it's called neoliberalism, but sometimes it's also called neoliberalism. It gets under our skin. It's so all-pervasive that it can actually be quite invisible. In fact, that's one of the definitions of a very successful ideology, is that it's not even apparent. You know, we drink it in with our mother's milk, and we sometimes find it difficult to actually imagine a different kind of world. I'm sure you've all heard the quote that it's often easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capital. And I'm sure many of you, even now, as I use the word capitalism, neoliberalism, I'll go on to talk about colonialism, we sometimes suffer from I think a shyness around naming these concepts, especially when we're trying to attract the attention of government and those who are in those ecosystems, policy ecosystems. For some reason, it has become beyond the pale to name these systems, to name their logics, and to name their destructive logics that so deeply colonize our institutions, our bodies, our minds, and our language. Now, let me move on. The Wellbeing Hub Ireland is a collaboration. It's an all-island collaboration, which is organized around the idea of a hub, which is the chosen form for each country's civil society to participate in the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. And the collaboration in Ireland involves FASTA. I'm sure many of you will have heard of the pioneering work that has been conducted for many years by FASTA. It's actually an Irish-based but international think tank, which has been problematizing capital and neoliberalism for some time. The other partners are the European Health Futures Forum, myself, based out of the School of Law in Belfast, Cultivate with Davy Phillip down in Cloughjordan, and the European Health Futures Forum. And we also have the wonderful participation, of course, of Colette from Social Justice Ireland. Now, this presentation today is about some of the work that we're planning to do, but it's a very personal take. Those of us who come together in the hub have our own perspectives, and what we do grows out of a dialogue and respect for some differences in our emphases, but nevertheless we've managed to agree enough for some very interesting initial work that will kick off at the end of this year and continue into early next year. So what are we planning to do? What's our first job of work? We've been very fortunate to have the support of the Carnegie United Kingdom Trust for a project that will involve what we're calling cultural creatives. As I've said, the idea of narrativity, the stories we live by. In fact, we talk about Ireland as it's an island of stories. You know, we're very familiar with the power of narrativity. And what we're going to do is to engage those who are working at the interface of a cultural activity, whether it's writing, music, theatre, other forms of performance, perhaps video making. We're going to recruit a number of cultural activists to deep dive with us into the, I suppose, this process of problematizing the dominant economic narrative, and invite them to think about ways in which they can help us mobilize conversations with various sectors and in the context of places. One group, for example, will be the Irish language community, working with them to see what the connections are, what are the new connections we can make between the stories, the traditions, the myths, the language, and the need to revisit our deepest assumptions about how we live and what we mean by well-being and what is imminent in those reflections in terms of a critique of the dominant systems that currently compromise our ways of being together, caring for one another, and relating differently to nature, for example. So that's will begin. We're in the research phase at the moment, and we'll be conducting a couple of deep dives, both in Northern Ireland, based at the Playhouse in Derry, which has become a real hub for the bringing together of cultural activity and the stimulation of conversation around climate change, around well-being, around the circular economy and other issues. And the second deep dive will take place in Clough Jordan. So let me share with you a little bit about the understanding that the Wellbeing Economy Alliance brings to this space. The WEAL founder, Catherine Trebeck, talks about the repurposing of economic goals and how this implies a deep shift in which social practices and worldviews need to change, and current path dependencies that lock in the current way of doing things need to be broken. So this is a transition that must take place at all levels, at the level of the niche or micro level, where innovation happens at the community or grassroots level. It happens at the level of the regime or the meso level, where the dominant norms, practices, policies, and rules prevail. This is where the dominant narrative, where we encounter the dominant narrative of capital commodification and accumulation. And then it also involves the level of the landscape, if you like, or macro level, which is the domain of the markets, culture, and political beliefs. Now, Catherine has a great book called The Economics of Arrival, Ideas for a Grown-Up Economy. And in the book, she problematizes economic growth and our national addictions to GDP, arguing that in the industrialized world, the great challenge is not to remain competitive or to increase efficiency or production. The challenge is to slow down without derailing the economy, to reimagine progress beyond more of the same. So in many ways, her project and the project of WeAll is about the challenge to make ourselves at home in the world. Now, let me see if I can share some slides just to give you one way in which we might think about that project, because the WeAll Hub in Ireland is not about downloading it's not about the transfer of a model of well-being, but an attempt to explore what an inflection of the well-being economy would look like, feel like, and how it would operationalize, given our own culture, given our own history, given our own stories across the island. Let me see if I can just throw up the slides for you. I'm not sure if I can actually. I think what I'll do is read my Zoom connection is not throwing up the opportunity to throw the slides up on the screen or to share the screen. So I'm going to just speak to the slides and give you a few thoughts as we go towards the close of the presentation. So I want to suggest to you that the context or one context for thinking about culture and the exploration of what a well-being or what well-being narratives might look like. One way to think about it is in the context of the literature and the practices associated with post-development. These are very interesting reflections. Many of them have their origins in the indigenous thought and critical practice of South America. Some of you will be familiar with writers who have been capturing some of the influences of these ideas in South America, people like Enrique Dusso and Arturo Escobar. Escobar he was responsible for coining this notion of the pluriverse, or popularizing that idea of the pluriverse, which goes back to the Zapatista dictum, a world fit for many worlds, a deep and radical pluralization of economic models that are reflective of our deepest values, often territorially or place-based, reflective of our own cultures and stories and ecologies, of course, as well. Now, one of the interesting things that I note in my paper is that this popularization of the pluralization of development models is a pushing back against the association, the deep, often hidden association between European forms of modernity and its economic forms, and of course the adventures, the imperial and colonial adventures, which have extended those norms and visions to every corner of the earth, often to our cost, both in terms of ecology and in terms of genocidal and ecocidal consequences for other territories. So in order to deconstruct, to interrogate the dominant narrative, I think we can look for great inspiration, both intellectual and practical, to the indigenous peoples and communities who are taking power, who are coming into power and empowering their ideas. And these ideas are not simply alternative forms of incorporating themselves into the dominant economy. These are changes, alternatives that have epistemological and even ontological challenges. In many ways, they correspond to art, they correspond to the work of the cultural creative, in the sense that these ideas of the pluriverse, of post-development, are about bringing something new into the world, including a different way of understanding our own place in the world, our own place in our localities, and our own place with nature, within nature, as entangled elements of nature. We must begin to re-embed, come home to our place within nature. And I was delighted to be associated recently with the Young People's Citizens Assembly, which is advising the Citizens Assembly on Biodiversity. The rights of nature was front, left, and centre of the Young People's recommendations to the Assembly, and these will go forward to the Dáil Committee, considering these recommendations as well. Now, the reason that the pluriverse, post-development, the decolonization of economics resonates for me, and I think it does for many of us on the island, is that we have a very interesting positionality, if you like. And I know this will not be news to you, but it's the context within which I feel that it's urgent and useful to borrow and engage in the ideas of the pluriverse. And the reason is that we are part of the European story. We do face into European modernity. We do that somewhat celebratory, in a celebratory way. But we also, historically, of course, are a colonized territory. And historically, in terms of aid and foreign policy, in civil society, have always maintained a deep interest, engagement, and empathy for those who have suffered the imposition of economic models from other parts of the world, with all of the costs that has implied. Moreover, I would say that the work of groups like Field Day, Seamus Heaney, for example, and Brian Friel, have anticipated the importance of looking at the ways in which colonialism and our language, our linguistic constraints, our ways of being and relating to power, that in many ways we have anticipated the pluriverse through our cultural activities, especially through the lens of Field Day's work and Brian Friel's work on language in particular. So there's a fascinating convergence, I think, in terms of the well-being economy conversation, the deep reflexivity that conversation invites, and the opportunity to inflect in a unique way, in a way that takes up our own story, our own history, and our own opportunities to embrace well-being, maybe in the style of Buen Vivir, which is part of this pluriversal thinking, alongside the rights of nature in parts of South America and Ecuador and Bolivia in particular. That there are opportunities to think deeply about well-being as a provocation, or to the policy conversation, to think about it as a provocation to begin to decolonize our own relationships with ourselves, our own histories, and our imposed economic models. After all, the island in many ways was a template for the colonization of the Americas. And we have a deep responsibility that springs from that imposed history, and part of the liberation of the island must be a liberation from those narratives and a liberation of the land itself. Thank you. Okay, Nick.
Thanks very much for that, Peter. Thank you indeed. Very interesting. And please stay with us. Now we're going to have a Q&A at the end of this session. And there's definitely generated some interest there. Absolutely. Our next speaker is Helen Howes from the Wicklow Public Participation Networks. Helen Howes is a resource worker with Wicklow Public Participation Network. She's over 20 years experience in the community sector as a volunteer and in a professional capacity. She's been involved in the evolution of the PPNs since their inception in 2014, working at local level and as a proactive member of the National Advisory Group. Helen was a member of the Wicklow PPN team, one of 4 PPNs that developed the vision for community well-being consultation and development process that is now being used by PPNs across the country. The title of Helen's paper is Visions for Community Well-being.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much, Mick, for that introduction. And thank you for having me. It's been absolutely fascinating to hear the international and national perspectives on the topic of well-being today, and then for me to link our work in County Wicklow with that and see the similarities. It's just been so interesting. So yeah, as Mick says, I'm talking to you today in my role as resource worker with County Wicklow PPN. So what I'd like to do is give you an introduction to the PPN and how it got into doing this work on well-being and developing these visions for community well-being, and where that's led us and what we've learned from that. So so PPNs at the most basic level are a network of many diverse community and voluntary groups, all operating in this community and voluntary sphere, the social inclusion sphere, or the environmental sphere. The PPN has 3 main functions. The first and most important function is to provide a structure and a process to facilitate community input into local policy and decision making. The second function then is to act as a channel of information from national and local government to communities on the ground, but more importantly, to feed what communities on the ground are saying back up to local and national government. And then our third function then is to support our member groups to engage and to do the work that they were set up to do. So there are 31 PPNs nationally, one in each local authority area, and their member groups in total, up as far as the end of 2021, was 17,548 community groups. And from our groups, we had 1,013 PPN community representatives sitting on 397 committees, and some of those would be the local authority strategic policy committees. The work of PPNs was first linked to wellbeing in the working group report on citizen engagement with local government, with further mention then in various department circulars, is that directed the vision for community wellbeing should be developed by PPNs and communities for each municipal district within the county or that local authority area. So from 2014, PPN stakeholders began the process of developing the structures and the practices that established the PPNs themselves and embedded them into the community. And while that was happening, and in tandem, a reference group was established at national level to support PPNs to develop their visions for community wellbeing. So funding then came from the Environment Protection Agency in late 2017 that enabled the development of a pilot project with the aim of providing a process or a toolkit to do this piece of work. So a call went out to PPNs then, and 4 were selected to participate in the pilot project, and the 4 were South Dublin, Longford, Roscommon, and ourselves here in Wicklow. And we were supported by Dr. Harriet Emerson, an independent consultant, Sarah Burke from Social Justice Ireland, Dr. Simon O'Rafferty from the Environment Protection Agency, and Michael Ewan and Justin Byrne from the Irish Environmental Network. So we kind of all met together then towards the, gosh, I think it was nearly Christmas 2017. And our first task then was to define what well-being was for the purpose of this project. So while well-being is often used to describe the physical and mental health of individuals, it was very quickly recognised that community well-being is much more than the health of its citizens. So community well-being includes conditions that are important for the whole community to thrive, and we've discussed that already today. So these conditions could involve any aspect of our environment, our society, or our economy. So eventually we developed this well-being graphic with these 6 themes, and our belief then was that if all the elements underneath these 6 themes were working properly, then the community would be well and it would thrive. So then we had to develop a process to run consultations with the community. So we organised workshops that were run in the heart of communities using the resources that the community was comfortable with. We began the consultations with asset mapping. So we were asking communities what they valued in their community and what they wished to preserve. Then we walked small groups around each of the wellbeing headings, and we asked them if their community was the best it could be under that particular heading, what would the community have? What would it look like? What would it feel like? After the physical workshops, we ran an online consultation, and then we drafted up a vision. So Wicklow began our pilot project in the Bolton Glass MD, particularly because we had, the most support there to do it, and it's the biggest MD in the county. So we ran 2 workshops, one in Hollywood, and the community in Hollywood would tell you they are the original Hollywood, not the one in America. And we also ran one in Carnew. And then we continued to run 2 workshops in each of the municipal districts, one in sort of the urban area and one in the rural hinterland, because it became apparent that, you know, sometimes if you run a workshop in the town, maybe the people from the country won't come, and vice versa. We ran the workshops in an online survey, and we took on board 2 written submissions. So from all the 11 physical workshops and the online survey, we ended up with about 2,500 individual inputs. Most of these were written on post-its and stuck to flip charts and had to be typed up. But the inputs were as diverse as the communities themselves, as well as being an indication of what their needs, interests and priorities were at that particular time. So these are just a few of the recurring messages that we heard from across the municipal districts in 2018 when we did this piece of work. So interestingly, although some of the messages were similar, they were often relayed in a way that was unique to the area. So, for example, under the work economy and resources heading, you could hear the regional difference. For example, in the Arklow Municipal District, you could hear their history of apprenticeships and manufacturing coming through and what they were saying. And then in Bray, you could hear their history of being a seaside holiday destination coming through. So you were getting a geographically unique perspective for the same thing, if that makes sense. The data itself we grouped it into themes under each heading, and that helped us develop an overall vision and high-level goals for each municipal district. Then we took the natural step and brought the municipal district visions together to develop a county vision, and you can see that there. And I should say that all the data, we put it into what we heard documents, and that and our visions, they're all on our website for anyone to see. And these goals and visions, it's what policies and actions and resultant decisions should be working towards in County Wicklow. So the benefit of doing this work was absolutely vast. All the Wicklow PPN stakeholders greatly benefited from undertaking the work in 2018. The main and lasting benefits were in the collaborative working, the relationship building and the networking that underpinned all the elements of our work. At the beginning, there was the learning and support from the development team. Then there was the real and positive engagement with our member groups. Then an added bonus was because the consultations themselves were quite intense and needed quite a bit of manpower, we spoke to our colleagues in other agencies and listed their help and helping us to facilitate. And this resulted in a deeper understanding and a mutual respect for each other's work. It also, the group networking was quite magical too, because it resulted in some grassroots community development. For example, when we did our consultation in Hollywood, the groups themselves had never come together in that area before, and they got so much out of it that they went on then to develop a network themselves, and a Hollywood Community Forum was born out of our consultations. And 12 months later, then they had kind of built themselves up to where they were kind of linking in with the Bolton Glass Forum to see how they could help each other and maybe progress pieces of mutual work. And that was just magic at the time. So Wicklow PPN uses the data gathered from the Vision for Community Wellbeing consultations regularly as a reference to direct all our work. For example, consultations in 2018 identified that groups struggle with bureaucracy and governance. So we would regularly run good governance training to support our member groups. We've also used the visions to maybe probe other organisations to take up a piece of work. For example, in 2018, a lot of people were saying about the importance of intergenerational learning. So we kind of brought that to the Wicklow Calling and Org and the Wicklow Older People's Council, and they kind of started doing pieces of work together. The data has been invaluable as a foundation for many PPN submissions to various local and national plans, actually, and it's so diverse it can change it to anything. And then they act as a reference and a mandate for our PPN representatives that sit on those local authority committees. Like with that behind them, they've got like a whole community behind them, and that's quite a comfort, as you can imagine. So as part of the process of developing the visions for community wellbeing, it was always intended that they would be reviewed to examine any changes in community priorities. So this year we joined forces with Wicklow County Council because they needed to go on the road anyway and do extensive consultation on developing the new local economic and community plan. So we said, look, at no point in us both going out to do extensive consultation with the same people. Why don't we do it together? And by the way, if we do it together, will you use our vision for community wellbeing process? And they said they would, which was marvellous. So we went on the road again, starting in February, and we went right through the summer. So we ran one online survey and we ran 8 physical workshops. Since then, actually, through the Local Community Development Committee, our PPN Wicklow County Council has accessed funding from the Department of Community, Rural and Development, and we're now one of 4 pilot projects that are researching strategies to engage hard-to-reach communities with the local economic and community plan development process. So that is actually underway at the moment. And I know it was something that's been kind of brought up and as a question in the chat, as how you reach those harder to reach communities. So comparing what we heard in 2018 and what we heard in 2022, there's a lot of similarity, but there also appears to be quite a few differences and some just even slight nuances. Some of the same issues, such as the lack of transport and the poor communications, the disconnection between local government and communities, the access to services and the better infrastructure, they were all kind of coming back again. But this year we noted that some of the language had changed around some of the issues. Terms such as connectedness and placemaking were used quite a lot. Now, back in 2018, keeping it local came out quite strong. And I suppose it did again, but in 2018, it mostly referred to the economy and employment, and about, you know, more jobs locally and keeping the economy local, and all about local governance as well. But in 2022, it just sounds a bit more about developing strong and resilient communities. There seems to be like this vision coming through of using a holistic approach to planning and development, and it was highlighted so that people in the environment could be nurturing and supportive of each other. Connections and connectedness were the predominant terms and kind of the strongest message that seemed to be coming through this year. Connectedness was used in relation to transport and to access to services and education, but it was also used in regard to information provision and communications, and it was used in relation to connecting people in place as well as connecting people with people. And discussions, I think it was, yeah, mostly it was an article that really kind of came through really strongly, where they were painting this vision of built environments that would be specifically designed so that there'd be no kind of physical divisions between them so that people could easily pass through and connect with others via green recreational areas that included places where people will socially interact. In 2018, people spoke about the need for more access to local government in the way of more conversation, more consultation, more local decision making and transparency within local decision making. But in 2022, it was this year, it was more than that. It sounded more than that. It kind of indicated that community groups are really beginning to recognise and have more confidence in the value of the work that they do with the limited resources that they have. I mean, many times, even the local authority would say that only for community and voluntary groups, they're often doing the work that possibly the local authority should be doing. And we've always known that, but there seemed to be a stronger sense of that this year. And the community groups also seem to recognise the limitations of local government more. And their vision seems to be that local authorities would interact with communities more so that they can pool their resources and work more together on things. And accompanying this was the vision that local communities should have the power and influence to affect local development and social change more than they do. So, what have we learned? We've kind of learned between 2018 and 2022, we've learned that well-being is subjective. It's like Maslow's theory of needs. Well-being is dependent on immediate needs. For example, well-being for some individuals might be governed by the basic need of putting food on the table, whereas for others that might be buying a second car. And similarly, community well-being can be influenced by the makeup of the group or what their purpose is or who their client group or membership is and what they're ultimately trying to achieve. So say for a traveller support group, this might be access to housing and basic human rights, whereas for a community council, it might be maintaining a hall for the community to use. Due to the diversity and the uniqueness of our communities and those living in them, there'll be differences and nuances in their wellbeing vision. And I think I kind of explained that in the sort of the difference in the economy and resources between Arklow and Bray, there's that uniqueness. And you know, looking back on it, that kind of took me by surprise a little bit, because I had thought when you were sort of talking about visions and that kind of high level, I thought that people would ultimately want the same things. And it was just fascinating hearing this uniqueness coming through. Well-being is vulnerable. I think that's probably the biggest lesson that I've taken on board this year. It's vulnerable to external influence, and it can change instantly and profoundly if it's significantly impacted. And I'm sure, like, you know, for an individual, you could be puttling along and life is normal, and then maybe suddenly you get a medical diagnosis that completely turns your life on its head. And I suppose then it's the same for communities, and the recent pandemic is a prime example, as is the current climate change and biodiversity loss crisis, as well as the impacts of the war in Ukraine. These global problems have brought concerns and challenges for local communities and have tested the resilience on many levels. And I think it's very possible that these events have influenced the difference in responses to the 2018 and the 2022 consultations as our communities change and adapt to their current situation. Just for us as well, like, we entered into this work with a very limited understanding of what community wellbeing was, and I was very skeptical of the value that the work would provide. However, the benefits, you know, that I've spoke about earlier in the presentation, they've been significant, and our learning continues with every conversation we have. More importantly, though, our engagement and relationship with our communities is richer because we undertook this piece of work. So just to finish, I suppose, since their inception, PPNs have developed themselves to be the key conduit for community engagement, or one of the key conduits. And the relationships we've built with our communities and our ability to network and facilitate connections are reaping huge benefits for all community stakeholders. And I think PPNs are ideally placed to continue this work, this valuable work of examining community wellbeing, documenting it, and using it to influence policy and decision making. Thank you very much.
Helen, thank you very much. Again, a different perspective, and that is that I think one of the big values today is we're getting perspective right from the global down to the very granular in terms of the local, and we already have some questions indirectly to yourself, and I think will form part of a wider discussion we may have after our final paper, which is to be delivered by Colette Bennett from Social Justice Ireland. Colette is economic and social analyst with Social Justice Ireland. Her research interests include housing, taxation, employment, participation, and the global south. She's a master's degree in social justice and public policy, and prior to working in the policy area was a solicitor in corporate law. She's a member of the NESC Wellbeing Consultation Working Group, is a current member of the Wellbeing Economy for All Steering Group, the Economics of Wellbeing Group, and has recently been appointed to Royal Irish Academy Social Sciences Committee. Colette's paper is entitled "What Counts When It Comes to Wellbeing?"
Thank you very much, Mick. What an incredible day. It's a real honor to be signing off today and to capping it all off. I hope I do it justice. We have had some phenomenal speakers, not least in the last hour or so. So thank you. And I also hope this goes well, because unlike the other speakers, I'm the only one who is employed by Social Justice Ireland, and they can really get me if this goes bad. So I'm going to share my screen now. Hopefully that will share okay. Is that all right? You can see the presentation? Perfect. So essentially what I'm looking at is the wellbeing framework, and we did reference it a little bit earlier on throughout the day, and that this commitment to a wellbeing framework was made in the programme for government, which recognised the failures of existing measures of economic performance. And as others have mentioned, there was a working group established within the Taoiseach's office for that interdepartmental perspective, and a consultation group established by NESC. And since then, there have been 2 reports, a dashboard report and a report from NESC. But what I'm going to concentrate this presentation and the paper in the conference proceedings on is the wellbeing dashboard, the dashboard report. So this is where we start, and it shows the 11 dimensions of the wellbeing framework. So we've subjective wellbeing, mental and physical health, income and wealth, knowledge, skills and innovation, housing and the built environment, environment, climate and biodiversity, safety and security, work and job quality, time use, connections, community and participation, civic engagement, trust and cultural expression. So there's a huge breadth of dimensions there. It really does cover kind of the whole spectrum in terms of well-being. And as others mentioned earlier on, it is drawn very heavily from the OECD 11 dimensions data set as well. And as was pointed out by Joe Little earlier on in the presentations this morning, when you look at the dashboard, it seems like we're doing a really good job, that, you know, we're doing exceptionally well. This is based on a set of 35 indicators spread across the 11 dimensions. Each of those 35 indicators is color coded, and then they're aggregated up to determine the dimensions color code overall. So green is for positive, white is for neutral, and red is for negative. And progress is measured either by looking at Ireland's progress over a 5-year period or against the EU 27 or 28, depending on the year that the indicator is for. And in the case of subjective well-being, for example, 2 of the 3 indicators used were coded green, so the dimension overall is coded green. As you can see, of the 11 domains, only 1 is showing a negative performance, 2 are white for neutral, and then the remaining 8 are green for positive progress. Now, again, it was pointed out by Joe, and I'm sure there are others who would look at this and think, well, maybe that doesn't reflect the reality on the ground or how people are experiencing these dimensions, these areas within their lives. And that obviously depends on what is counted, what indicators are being used. But what if we counted things differently? So that was the challenge, I suppose, that we undertook when we were looking at this earlier on in the year. So what we did is we conducted a survey during the summer. We asked people to consider the 11 domains. We included the existing indicators that were used in the government's wellbeing dashboard so that, you know, they were given their fair chance. And we proposed a few more based on existing data sets, either available from Eurostat, from the Central Statistics Office, or from other government sources or reputable sources. We ranked them 1 to 6 because we had 6 in each dimension. And then they were weighted and they were color coded. And again, they were color coded using the same system that was set out in the report on the wellbeing dashboard. So green for positive performance, red for negative performance, yellow for positive progress in an Irish context, but negative in an EU or vice versa, and white where there's insufficient data really to establish where we are with the indicator. And essentially then we created a new dashboard. So what I'm going to do for the rest of the slides, and I will do it as briefly as I can, is just to go through the comparison between ours and the wellbeing dashboard report. So taking subjective well-being, for example, you can see from, we have the government's dashboard there that it's overall the dimension is green, ours is white. And the reason for that will become clear as I talk you through the various indicators. You'll see that the first indicator, overall life satisfaction, is used by both ourselves and by government, but it's color coded differently. This indicator is based on a CSO data set that was last gathered in 2018 and compared to a release before that, which was from 2013. So overall, with a rate of 0.4% in 2018, increasing from 30.8 in 2013, and comparing well to the EU average, we appear to be doing quite well. However, the reason that ours is different is that the CSO data set is further broken down by age group and self-perceived health status. And if we use health status as a proxy for marginalization, and we know there are correlations there, we look at the gap between the proportion of those who reported their health as very good and those who reported it as fair, bad, or very bad, with an overall life satisfaction rating of high. And we see that the gap there increased from 19.7 percentage points to 34.7 percentage points within the period that we're talking about. So those with poorer health outcomes are falling further behind. Similarly, at a European level, the data is disaggregated by educational attainment level. And again, we're using a proxy here where we use lowest and highest educational attainment, because we know, again, there's a strong correlation between educational attainment and the rate of poverty risk. So Ireland again compares well, having the highest rate of life satisfaction among the population with the lowest educational attainment and the 6th lowest gap between lowest and highest educational. So therefore, our indicator is coded white here. On the government's dashboard, the proportion of the population who didn't feel downhearted or depressed in the last 4 weeks also decreased. So that's coded green for progress, while the proportion of school children who report being happy with their lives also unfortunately decreased. So that's coded red because that's a negative. On our own dashboard, we use the indicator from the CSO, which scores social inclusion. Now that's used elsewhere in the government's report, and we'll come back to that in a minute. Here, Ireland scores 7.5 out of 10. And at a European level, we compare very well for the proportion of the population with some or severe self-perceived long-standing limitations in usual activities due to health problems at 16.4% in 2019, which was the 4th lowest across the EU 28 and down from 17.6 in 2014. So that's why that's coded green. And then finally, under our version, we turn to access to public services. And that data is based on the CSO Trust Survey, which includes a rating of satisfaction with public services. And the indicator is coded white because it relates to 1 year only, but the proportion of the population who are satisfied with the administrative services and education system is quite high. It's 63% and 70% respectively, while 32% were satisfied with the health system. So you'll see overall that there's quite a difference there depending on the indicators that are used. Moving on then to mental and physical health. And again, you see this was coded green on the government's report. We have the 6th highest healthy life years in the EU. We have a population reporting depression taken from the Irish Health Survey is marked white because there's no comparator there. And then finally, there's the proportion of people aged 15 plus with self-reported unmet need for medical attention. Now, this is referenced in the report as unmet need for medical examination or care due to financial, geographic or waiting time reasons. And it's taken from the EU Silk database, which refers to just 2% in 2020. The proportion reported by Eurostat has remained static since 2018, and it's the same as the European average, more or less, in 2021. So that's why it's coded yellow, because it performed positively over time, but kind of negatively in relation to the EU. However, the Irish Health Survey 2019, which kind of feeds into this, indicates that while 2% of the population reported an unmet need for healthcare due to transport or distance, 14% of the population reported an unmet need due to waiting time. So the proportion for people who are classified as very disadvantaged increases to 18%, almost double that of very affluent people. And if we bear in mind what we're looking for ultimately from this well-being, to close that disadvantage gap, to look at what Carrie Exton referred to earlier on as the size of the gap between the top and the bottom of distribution, these factors become extremely relevant when we look at well-being. In the Social Justice Ireland dashboard, we also look at the inability to afford adequate healthcare set out in the Irish Health Survey. So that's that kind of 14 and 18%, which we have there. And we look at the number of people awaiting outpatient treatment. That increased by 47% between 2016 and 2022. And that's why our indicator is coded red. Moving on then to income and wealth. And again, you'll see the government's dashboard codes this for green, as in positive progress, where we are white. And the reason we're white is because each of our indicators has a different color coding, and that aggregates up to white. So the median real household income indicator is another one that's used both in the government's dashboard and our own. It increased by 22% from 2014 to 2019, and so it's coded green on the government's dashboard. However, not included in that report, but of relevance to well-being, is how income is distributed by household type. So a one-adult household had a median real household income of just over 23,000 in 2021, which was down from 2020. At an EU level, the indicator is median equivalized household income. And in 2021, we ranked 3rd in the EU behind Denmark and the Netherlands. And we've coded this indicator white. Median net wealth, which is referenced in the government's dashboard, increased between 2013 and 2018 based on the Household Finance and Consumption Survey. And therefore, that's coded green there. The only indicator that wasn't favorable here was the government's net wealth, which saw a decline between 2016 and 2019. On our own, we noted the decline in the level of poverty since 2016 as a good thing, and the relative position of Ireland compared to the EU 27 average, which is why that's coded green. In terms of income distribution, we looked at the top 10% of the population compared to the bottom 10%. The top 10% received more than 1/5 of the total income, while the bottom decile received just 4.1%. And collectively, the poorest 50% of households received a lower share, 31.7%, to the top 20% at 36.5%. So overall, the share of the top 10% is almost 6 times the share of the bottom 10. And that's why that indicator there is coded red. In terms of knowledge, skills and innovation, they're both green. Ireland's track record on education is quite good. Yes, there are absolutely educational disadvantages, but the policies that have been put in place are having a positive impact. There is still a ways to go, but they're certainly having a positive impact in this area. The one area of interest to those we surveyed where Ireland doesn't perform quite so well is on digital skills. Over 55% of the population have low or basic digital skills, and over 1/3 of the adult population have low digital skills, well above the EU average. So again, that indicator there is coded white, but overall they're both green. Then we move on, sorry, I've gone off the rails altogether. Then we move on to housing and the built environment. And this is probably one of the first ones that people kind of link into when they see the government's dashboard. Yes, the number of new dwelling completions has increased recently, but from a very low base due to the last recession. It's also positive that there has been an increase in A and B rated homes, but again, these are mainly in newer and, dare I say, more expensive properties. The at risk of poverty rate after rent and mortgage interest is included in both dashboards, but coded differently again. This is a data set that's only been included twice in the Silk releases, and the European comparator is slightly different in that it refers to housing costs rather than specifically rent or mortgage interest. So housing costs include more than just those payments. So there isn't a comparator of like for like there. When it comes to housing affordability, we can see that that has worsened in recent years, becoming less affordable between 2013 and 2019, with just a slight recovery in 2020. However, it must be noted that an affordability calculation based on earnings in 2020 will be distorted as average earnings increase due to layoffs in lower income jobs during the pandemic. Between 2012 and 2020, house prices increased by 77% compared to wage growth of just 23% in the same period. And asking prices in the year to December 21 increased by 14.4%, which was just slightly under the 2007 peak, which is why housing affordability is coded red here. And finally here, mortgage debt burden for those who are most at risk of homelessness refers to borrowers in mortgage arrears of over 10 years. The latest data indicates that 7,870 home mortgages were in arrears for over 10 years in June. Almost 6,000 of those are in PDHs or primary dwelling houses, while 2,000 are on BTLs or buy-to-lets. But they are essentially somebody's home, even if you're renting it. So at a Europe, that's an increase on the previous year. At a European level, Ireland had the second highest rate of arrears on mortgage or rent payments in the EU in 2021 at 7%, second only to Greece at 8.5%. And that again is why that's coded red, and that aggregates up to red. Sorry, I can't actually see what I'm looking at here. Sorry. Moving on to environment, climate and biodiversity. Really, there's no one that can disagree with this. Both dashboards code progress on the environment quite poorly, irrespective of the indicators that are used to come to that conclusion. And I'm not going to dwell on that because there is such a similarity between the two. And there's a lot more discussion on that area within the paper, which will be part of the proceedings. Then it comes to safety and security. For the government dashboard, the murder rate is relatively low per 100,000 of the population, and the number of people killed or injured on the roads has remained relatively static, which is an indicator that's shared across the two dashboards. There's no standard recording, and the population of those who worry they could be a victim of crime. Again, there's just insufficient data to really compare that. For our own, when we did our survey, gender-based violence and racism were top of the list. So there's no standard recording of gender-based violence. However, the number of recorded crime instances related to sexual offences increased by 38.5% between 2016 and 2021, while fraud and theft offences, including financial control, increased by 247% in that period. In a European context, data available from the European Institute of Gender Equality indicates that Ireland ranked 9th for the number of sexual assaults on women in 2021 and 6th for rape. So that's why that indicator is coded red. Now, I do need, I'm saying it for video purposes, but it is also explicitly said in the paper. These statistics from the CSO are published under reservation due to data quality issues with the Pulse system. And there's an explanatory note on the CSO website there. There's also been a 50% increase in the proportion of the population who experienced discrimination between Q1 2014 and Q1 2019, with non-Irish nationals, people from religions other than Roman Catholic, and the unemployed experiencing higher levels than the general population. And again, that indicator is coded red and the overall dimension is coded red also. In terms of work and job quality, the labour market underutilisation rate captures the unmet need for employment in Ireland and has remained relatively static over time. The proportion of people in employment and at risk of poverty decreased from 5.69% in 2014 to 4.4% in 2019. While not comparable due to a change in time series, 2020 had a rate of 6.2%, decreasing to 4.4 in 2021. Mean weekly earnings were also used in the government's dashboard. These have increased from 717.52 in Q4 2016 to 863.70 in Q4 2021. And that's why it's green in the government's dashboard. However, again, with an eye to the disparities and the inequalities, we had another look in terms of the disparity of income across various sectors. And again, there's more data on that in the paper, but that is why we have coded it differently. We've coded it red. And then the rate of long-term unemployment over 12 months decreased from 3.2% in Q2 2017 to 1.1% in Q2 2022. And that's why that indicator is coded green. And for both, overall, the dimensions are green. In terms of time use, the proportion of people in Ireland working long hours in their main job increased between Q4 2016 and Q4 2021. And Ireland has a higher rate than the EU average. So in both dashboards, this is red in terms of this indicator. Again, as with all other aspects of the labour market included in the wellbeing framework, the average proportion conceals inequalities, with proportions ranging from 4.2% of people employed in human health and social work activities to 46.6% of people employed in agriculture, forestry and fishing working very long hours. While the data on caring relates to just 1 year, and again, that's why it's white in the government's dashboard, the gendered and age-related dimension should be considered here. So the government's wellbeing dashboard report contains no data on the European level. However, an article in the International Journal of Health Policy and Management published this year and based on data from 2016 contains some detail on the average weekly caregiving hours per carer and indicates that Irish carers were 4th in the EU 28 in terms of average weekly caregiving hours per carer and had the highest annual non-professional caregiving value per carer at €15,002. So we've coded that red, and there's more data again in the paper with some charts that really show that. And then finally, the average commuting times increased from 27.5 minutes in 2011 to 28.2 minutes in 2016. And at a European level, Ireland is joint 3rd with Belgium in terms of the length of average commuting time at 28 minutes. While these data sets will certainly have been impacted by changes to work arrangements resulting from the pandemic, based on these indicators, we've coded it red and the overall dimension is therefore red. Moving on then to connections, community and participation. There are 2 indicators here in the government's dashboard: the proportion of the population who feel lonely, which is only available for 1 reference period and is therefore coded white, and the proportion of the population with at least 2 people they can rely on. This was 77% in 2019. This indicator is also green on our own dashboard. And again, it looks at an indicator on the OECD Better Life Index, which measures the proportion of people who believe they can rely on their friends in need in cases of need, where we rank at 96%, joint third with Finland and Norway, behind Iceland and the Czech Republic. We have also included access to green or recreational space here based on the survey responses. The CSO have a really interesting data set, household environmental behaviours, visits to nature areas report, and that found that urban green spaces were the most popular type of green and natural space visited by Irish households in Q3 of 2021, with 32% of households visiting most days and a further 34% visiting most weeks. The figure was higher for urban households, with 74% visiting most weeks. Fields, farms and countryside and woodland or forest areas were then visited by 31% of households most weeks. At a European level, data from the European Environment Agency on urban green spaces places Dublin in the bottom half of the EEA countries in terms of total green infrastructure, second for urban green space and the bottom third for urban tree cover. So while the data presents a positive picture due to lack of comparable data, the indicator is coded white here. Civic engagement, trust and cultural expression. This is the final dimension, you'll be delighted to know. And these indicators here on the Social Justice Ireland website, dashboard, where trust in national government, satisfaction with how democracy works in Ireland, and voter turnout in national elections. So you'll note that satisfaction with how democracy works in Ireland is again coded differently in both dashboards. We've coded it white due to the lack of comparative data for this particular indicator. The proportion of people who stated that they were satisfied with how democracy works in Ireland was 76% in spring 2021, which was 5th highest in Europe. However, there's a significant difference between this and the proportion of the population who responded positively to the questions, how much trust do you have in the national government or national parliament, asked on behalf of the European Commission as part of its what's called the Eurobarometer, the standard Eurobarometer in summer 2022. Just 46% responded that they tended to trust the national government, compared to 49% who tended not to, while 44% tended to trust the national parliament, compared to 49% who did not. European comparison is also available within that data set. So Ireland at 46% ranks comparatively highly and is 12 percentage points ahead of the European 27 average. We've previously dealt with both discrimination and social inclusion, so I'm not going to go into too much detail in that. The proportion of people who stated that they were satisfied with how democracy works, we've already looked at as well. And then finally, on our own, voter turnout for the general election 2020 was 62.9%, which is a decrease of 2.2 percentage points on general election 2016, and that comes from the Oireachtas Library Research Service. So looking at the alternative dashboard, once the data is coded, this is essentially how it looks, and it indicates that there's considerable room for improvement if the vision and the goals that are set out in the revised wellbeing framework are to be achieved. Just 2 dimensions showed positive progress: knowledge, skills and innovation, and work and job quality, while 4 showed neutral progress and the remainder showed negative progress. To compare it with what is set out in the Wellbeing Dashboard report, you can see that the various changes there, the various differences there. Again, it's a key, I suppose, policy area for Social Justice Ireland is the concept of this new social contract. And we've done a lot of work, both publications and a whole conference on it in recent years. And we've consistently proposed this framework that identifies the 5 key policy outcomes: a vibrant economy, decent services and infrastructure, just taxation, good governance and sustainability. Each of those 5 key policy outcomes must be achieved if a new social contract is to be achieved. It's not enough to have 3 or even 4 of the 5 while neglecting the other areas, and all 5 must be worked on simultaneously. It's not a question of getting the economy right and then hoping that everything will follow. We've seen that doesn't work. However, when we look at the wellbeing dimensions, and I can absolutely promise you that when I was putting the various dimensions into this framework, it was blind. It was on the basis of what fit best where. We can see, though, that the same thing is happening again in terms of the priority of the economy as against the other areas. So the takeaway on this, I mean, all of the indicators that have been used across the two dashboards, they're all valid. They're all, you know, either national or international indicators. They're based on a really robust data sets. But the question needs to be asked of, if there are thousands of indicators to choose from, who gets to do the choosing? We need a really inclusive process, and many of our speakers, including Clodagh Harris and Helen Howes, referenced earlier on this need for an inclusive process. We would very much support that, and in fact that we would, you know, propose a multi-stakeholder working group to be established to monitor this on an ongoing basis, to make sure that the indicators that are being used are fit for purpose, and that properly and accurately reflect how people experience well-being in Ireland. And perhaps a good way of looking at it would be to follow the social dialogue model, or the NESC model. And with that, I would say thank you very much.
Thanks very much for that, Colette. Thank you, and very interesting it is. And we have a number of questions for all three of our panelists at the moment. But Colette, if I could just, from where you left off, we have one question here, I think that captures a lot of it. Isn't there a need for a dashboard that effectively catches the key challenges citizens identify? For example, housing, cost of living, health, climate, etc. The government dashboard fails on this measure. And could I suggest, Colette, that that feeds into what you touched on there, and that is that well-being to some extent is seen as an adjunct to the economy rather than an integrated part of what governance in any way should be about. And to some extent, what I took from your presentation is that it is being presented in a very positive manner, perhaps so as not to have too much emphasis on it being something that requires a lot more attention, if I could put it that way.
Again, I think it's based on need of a real understanding of what matters to people. So in terms of the need for a dashboard that effectively catches the challenges, the well-being dashboard should do that conversely. So in those areas where that should be coded red, should be the key areas where there are challenges, which is why it's surprising when you look at the dashboard that is published, that it's, you know, that areas that people experience hardship in, such as housing and health, are coded green. So it's about looking at what is available, and there are thousands of indicators that are available that could more accurately reflect the real position that is the experience of people, I suppose. You know, I don't think there's any kind of, or, you know, I don't think there's any kind of Machiavellian intent, perhaps, but it's really about getting accuracy, which is why you need multiple stakeholders. You know, everyone has a bias, and I think that's something that should be brought together, thrashed out, to build something that is much more robust and much more accurate.
Yeah, I take your point about no Machiavellian intent, but, you know, are we to some extent back to our old friend, you know, this thing of commissioning a consultant? Very often one finds that the consultant that is commissioned to produce a report knows the kind of report that's expected and comes up with those kind of results. And one would wonder whether the government's dashboard is informed by the idea that perhaps our well-being is better than it might actually be. And, you know, you'd have to wonder, is there something there? Like,
well, if you look at the dimensions that are used, and the dimensions are really comprehensive, you know, those 11 areas cover an awful lot. And if you take a social dialogue approach to it, if you had stakeholders, not just from government, but also local government, state agencies, and then also from civil society, so community, voluntary, social inclusion, from the employers, from the trade unions, from farming, from environment, and had everybody input into it, everybody engaged in how people should be consulted, who was consulted, what indicators should be used in relation to that, it would be a much more dependable and comprehensive, and people, I suppose, would have greater trust in it.
Right. Yeah, fair enough. That's a fair point of view. Now, Helen, for yourself, just in terms of the PPNs, question here, is there a danger or temptation that PPNs could distract from their policy work on well-being? And I presume that is the organization and the facilitation of PPNs becoming more of a focus than the actual policy work for which the PPNs would be there.
That is a really good question. Is there a danger? Yes, I suppose there is. When you're dealing closely with community and voluntary groups, and they need support, and it could be very easy to because there is this lack of resources to do this community development type work with community groups. It is a danger that you could slide into that. I do think, though, that in doing the Division for Community Wellbeing work, that does focus the PPN. I mean, we haven't pulled together all our data from the 2022 consultations yet. We've just been too busy, and we haven't developed the visions yet. But we've already started using that data. I mean, within those consultations, there was a lot of talk about waste management. And recently at our last council meeting, Wicklow County Council was discussing putting a charge on the recycling centres. And we were instantly able to lift that conversation about waste management through our consultations and fire it off to the elected representatives and say, look, this is what the people of Wicklow think about waste management. And you might want to consider that when you're going in to vote, whether you put a charge on the recycling sector. So doing the wellbeing work itself will actually focus the PPN. But yes, honestly, I suppose there is always that little bit of danger that you might slide into community development.
And just on the PPNs as well, Helen, the difficulty of ensuring that the PPNs are entirely representative of society across, I mean, that must be an issue no more than it is for other areas, like, for instance, politics in general and that kind of thing. Trying to the greatest extent ensure that it's entirely representative of society.
Yeah, absolutely. But it is our resource that our PPN representatives, and it's within all our policies, our code of conduct. It's stated from the beginning, the middle, the end, that our PPN representatives are there to represent the PPN as a whole, and not just their own individual group or opinion, even though they bring that experience with them. And then we would back that up by, developing focus groups or linkage groups that would support that PPN rep to make sure that the whole community voice is being heard as much as possible. And I mean, even in writing our submissions, I mean, we are charged with the fact that we bring all the diverse voices and opinions, and we have done that even within submissions where the majority view can be seen, but we have still acknowledged and valued the minority, included that, whether it be in an appendices to a submission or wherever we would honour that voice. That's important to us because that's what will continue the engagement with our membership. If we lose their trust, then we've lost. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. And as you say, it goes to the heart of the whole system. Peter, just coming to you again, and very interesting presentation from you. And I know you've addressed some of this in the chat, but the dominant intent, the neoliberal focus, if you want to put it that way, challenging that in order to prioritize the likes of well-being, that's a perennial problem. It's a difficult one to grasp.
Well, it is, and it's an urgent one. I think we're all familiar with that phrase now. I think that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. That doesn't mean that it's a project that we need to turn away from. And I think what's distinctive in today's world is that there are very significant social movements that are directing their energy towards the pushing back against the imposition of the logics of capital and neoliberalism. It's certainly, when we talk about the word or use the word development, development is now received in these social movements in parts of Latin America as an extension of the colonial project, and there's a reassertion of the right to design economies, redesign economies in the image of local cultures and communities and ecologies. The fact that it's a question that is difficult and seems overwhelming seems to make it more urgent, because the difficulty is that the neoliberal system is very good at absorbing the language of well-being. It's very good at absorbing and co-opting our efforts, and even, I suspect some of these efforts around frameworks and indicators and the proliferation of methodologies. The system likes to keep us busy, but as Tim Jackson used to say, we have a problem with the indicators industry reinventing itself every 10 years. I was sat through hours and hours of sessions in New York talking about indicators of sustainable development, and then it was indicators of local Agenda 21, and now it's indicators of well-being. Unless there's actually a social movement behind this project, unless there's not only a desire to assert visions of well-being, but to understand the way in which our dominant narrative limits and constrains our imaginations, I don't think we're at the races at all in terms of this conversation.
But do you see, Peter, particularly, I suppose, in the wake of the pandemic, and perhaps what you might call awakenings in particular way, that there's any more urgency among a growing section of the population to address that?
Well, I do think that there are interesting movements, including those in Europe, that are beginning to talk about revaluing the foundational, what we call the foundational economy, those parts of the economy that have to do with care and the provision of public services, and repurposing, revaluing, and centering activities like care. That has come onto the agenda. And it's also true, I'm sitting here after a climate change event, that the IPCC and other climate leaders are now talking about the need to connect critiques of economic growth and the trajectories of the 1% and the capitalist project, that we need to begin to link up these conversations with issues like climate change and biodiversity loss. So there is a new energy behind these questions, and I think there's a new courage emerging in civil society, both in Europe but beyond as well, and especially because of the democratic breakthroughs for indigenous communities in parts of Latin America, that there are deep critiques that go beyond choices between economic models, but really invite us to have a good look at ourselves.
Okay, and Helen, just from your perspective in terms of the input at that local level, do you sense any growing awareness for people who want to be more participatory, and as well a realization that well-being will require that input from so many people if there's going to be that kind of change?
I think so, and I think kind of COVID was probably responsible. I think because of the shutdowns, it brought us all back into our 5K local community, and people had to become more self-sufficient within those communities, and they did. I think the evidence is that community groups just galvanized themselves instantly to support the most vulnerable in that community. And I think that in a way has probably helped them to see just how important the local community groups are themselves. And I think that's given them the added confidence and the boost to kind of push more at the local authority and say, look at lads, for years, you've kind of been dependent on us to kind of do this, and we are delivering for you. And now we want to work with you. That's kind of what we were hearing. It was quite amazing to listen to it, and it was all done in good humour. It wasn't an angry pushback. It was like, come on now, we have to work together on this. It was brilliant. Mm-hmm.
Okay, and Colette, just turning to you finally, I mean, we heard the Governor of the Central Bank earlier, and it would seem that perhaps countries like New Zealand are somewhat ahead of us heading down this road. I mean, are you confident that we're on a trajectory to head in the same direction?
That's a really hard question to answer. Am I confident? No, not with what I've seen so far. But what I would be is hopeful that we could get a process up and running that will make it function. Because the difficulty with, and it was an interesting question that came in around, should we have a dashboard on what's going wrong? Because if the dashboard functioned correctly, you wouldn't need a negative one. You'd be able to focus on a positive one, because essentially what this is meant to do, the dashboard is just a tool. It's meant to drive policy. But if you have a dashboard that says, do you know what, everything's grand except the environment, which we know that we're pretty bad at, then where do you focus your policy on? You only focus on the thing that you consider needs it. So that's why we need that much more participatory piece that shows, right, what is actually meaningful to us? What do we care about? How is that measured? How does that work? And then where there are failings, how do we address it? Because that's where the work is. But all of that comes down to political choices. It isn't a case of like, am I optimistic? I'm not sure. I think we've seen some very good decisions being made, but I think we've seen a huge amount of bad ones. I think the latest budget, for example, a kind of a free for all. It was lauded as this really comprehensive cost of living, but when you do the analysis, which we did within, a matter of hours of it, that wasn't the real picture. And I think that's what needs, we need a critical eye. We need to be able to interrogate things, because this is policy, and policy is about people's lives, people's lived experience, and that's the thing that needs to be reflected.
Indeed, I think there's no doubt about that. If we're all to move anyway towards well-being for all, and I think all we can say is conversations like today and the analysis and the input hopefully is going to form some basis for moving forward, and notice will be taken in the centres of power, if I could put it that way, that this type of thing needs far greater attention. That brings to the end this session. I want to thank very much to Peter Dorn, Helen Howes, and to Colette Bennett. And in turn, that brings us to the end of the conference, certainly my role in it. And for our closing remarks, I'm going to hand you back once more to the man himself, Sean Healy.
Thanks, Mick, and thanks, everybody. It's been a tremendous conference, tremendous day. It's the 35th annual conference in this series of conferences. They stretch all the way back to 1988. So it maintained and even surpassed the standard that has been set, and it's been a very high standard. So I'm absolutely delighted that we had such a very, very good conference. I want to say a special thank you to the speakers who've done a fantastic job, to Sabina Al-Kira from the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, to Colette Bennett from Social Justice Ireland, the brave woman, the only person who was, as she said herself, employed by us. Anyway, she came through it with shining, with flying colours. Peter Doran from Queen's, Clodagh Harris from UCC, Helen House from Wicklow PPN, Helen Johnson, Anne-Marie McGowan and Larry O'Connell from NESC, Riley Lampi in the Finnish ambassador, Gabriel Malouf, this Governor Central Bank, and Carrie Exon from the OECD. I was trying to do those in alphabetical order, but anyway, I just wanted to say a very sincere thank you to the speakers, because it's quite obvious that they put a huge amount of effort into the papers that they presented, and I think that they reflect their reflections on the well-being that they came up with would be something that will be very useful in the period from here on, as we try to further make impacts on how well-being is being addressed in Ireland itself. I think ultimately as a nation, we want to be well, to be safe, to be fulfilled, and we want to ensure that that not only is that true for us, but that it's also true for coming generations. And hopefully the papers today will make a contribution to that project. Now, we of course always make the same point in all the conferences we run, that we do not attempt to cover all questions that arise around the topic. We can't possibly do that, but the papers presented, I think, have something quite serious to say. And if you want to go further and catch in or check in to the publication, the book containing the papers of the conference will be available online from Monday, and all participants will receive an email send to bring it to their attention, and there'll be a link there. We also will have the actual presentations and so on the website with the various other PowerPoint presentations and so on. We would hope that the issues get taken up. Colette was talking there about how the budget was presented or taken, understood to be in a particular way, very positive. Although the analysis would suggest something else altogether. The failure of media generally, with a few notable exceptions, including the one present here, there has been, for the most part, a complete failure at media level, national media level, to communicate the results, the outcomes, the impacts of that budget. That's just, I'm saying that in passing because I would hope that media would communicate the ideas that we were talking about here today, that all the speakers have presented, because I think they're very positive items that and very, very good insights that need to be part of the ongoing discussion. So once again, a very, very special thank you to everybody, particularly the participants who stayed with us right through till now. Having had a very long day, we're very grateful for your participation. We hope you got something from it, of some value, etc. And I think all that remains for me to say is a special thank you, to embarrass him for the second time today, to Mick Clifford for doing a terrific job anchoring what was a pretty demanding day, but there was so much stuff going on there, and hold it all together. We really, really appreciate that. So to everybody, thank you very much. Thank you.